and made people's lives much more predictable. But after just 6 months of them being in power, the Americans and the Ethiopians and a few others, they basically labelled this Islamic Courts Union, as it was called, as a sort of Al-Qaeda affiliate, having sympathy with violent Islam, and they bombed them out of existence. And what happened was that the sort of armed youth wing that had been associated with the courts, they disappeared.
Hi, and welcome to a special series and a special episode of The Horn, a podcast from the International Crisis Group. I'm Alan Boswell. And this is the finale of our 5-week mini-series, Eastern Africa's Jihadis, produced in partnership with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, or FES. Today, we're trying something a bit different. We've brought on a fantastic and timely panel to discuss how the global war on terror has shaped the trajectory of the region in the past 20 years and where it all heads from here. With us, we have Mary Harper, Africa editor at the BBC and author of 2 books on Somalia, including her most recent on Al-Shabab, Michael Woldemariam, a professor and director of the African Studies Center at Boston University, and Murithi Mutiga, Crisis Group's Horn of Africa director. Thanks to all of you for coming on.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Yeah, thanks, Alan.
Now, we've done a little series here looking at the current state of jihadism in East Africa and a bit of its history. When we planned this, we didn't know we'd have such a dramatic backdrop as we've gotten with Afghanistan to sort of mark this moment. But as I was preparing this and looking back, I have to say I didn't quite realize how much, this 20-year period has really shaped the region country by country. When you go through from Sudan and the birth of South Sudan to Eritrea and Ethiopia to Kenya and Uganda and, of course, Somalia, it's difficult to find a country whose fate wasn't drastically affected by what happened on 9/11 and then, of course, subsequently. So, Mary, I'm going to start with you. We're fortunate to have you as you've been covering this region for so long. And we've been in this 9/11 era for, such a long time that it's difficult to really think back before then sometimes. So can you help us out? What did the U.S. approach in the region look like before 9/11? And then how did you really see it shift?
Sure. I mean, what we mustn't forget is that before 9/11 in the US, there were very big Al-Qaeda attacks in East Africa. The US embassies in Tanzania and in Kenya were hit by Al-Qaeda in 1998, leading to very large amount of deaths. So in some ways, East Africa, the Horn of Africa, was already primed for this. Also, Osama bin Laden had for some time spent time in Sudan in the 1990s. So in some ways, the kind of groundwork was already done. But then obviously when 9/11 happened and the world's foremost superpower was struck directly, this then kind of changed things on the ground in the Horn of Africa and East Africa once again. And George Bush very soon afterwards pointed the finger at least at a Somali money transfer company, blaming it for being a major source of funding for Al-Qaeda. So I think there is a kind of before and an after story in terms of how those events of 9/11 hit Africa, because it was already being affected and continues to be affected to this day.
Now, Murithi, you were, of course, in Nairobi during those events in the 90s. I'm just wondering if you can reflect on that pre-9/11 period, and then also, how has life since changed?
Thanks, Alan. And I think Mary makes a very good point. I would go even further back that, unhappily for this region, jihadism has been a part of life for a very long time. You had in the late 80s members, especially of Al-Ittihad al-Islami, this group in Somalia, moving to the mountains of Afghanistan to train partly with bin Laden's group. But then also you had recruits from places like Sudan, to a lesser degree, the Kenyan coast and Tanzania. And then, as Mary rightly pointed out, a hinge point was bin Laden moving to Sudan in the early 90s. And in that period, then you had a chain of events that touched this region very, very significantly. You had, for example, a few of bin Laden's early recruits moving to Somalia, training some of the people involved in the Black Hawk Down episode. You had the horrific attacks in Nairobi on August 7th. I was in high school at that time. My high school had just closed, and some of my classmates were actually right outside the embassy when the bomb went off. It was a period of profound shock, a period of profound confusion. Nobody had heard of Al-Qaeda. How has it changed the region? I would say that in the first phase, people saw it as an external problem. But then the global war on terror, so-called, began. Many of the governments in this part of the world enlisted themselves, and then it became a war in which civilians were paying an incredible price. I don't remember ever encountering security guards going into supermarkets, into banks, into various shops or malls in Nairobi. I was very stunned a couple of years ago to see that the biggest private sector employer in the country is not somewhere in agriculture, is not in tourism, it's actually private security companies. You see CCTV everywhere, the airport is ringed by security. Life has changed very substantially, and of course we can discuss further what mistakes were made to get to this point.
Michael, I'm going to go over to you, and I'm wondering, besides any reflections you might have on what Mary and Murithi said, when you think of what changed in the equation after 9/11 for the U.S., what exactly did that look like? And as Murithi mentions, how did regional governments get sucked in as well?
Yeah, so I would say that one would be hard-pressed to find sort of a clear strategic line from the United States or Western countries towards the Horn in the pre-9/11, this period from the end of the Cold War till 9/11. I mean, counterterrorism certainly wasn't a huge issue. There was a lot of focus on humanitarian concerns. I mean, see the US-UN intervention in Somalia in the 1990s. I think humanitarianism was the big impetus there. But I think as Murithi and Mary have noted, there were obviously concerns about jihadist networks in the region, and much of that centered on the role of Sudan in facilitating some of those networks. So in the 1990s, the United States relationship with Sudan really hits rock bottom because of Khartoum's kind of involvement with these networks. And the United States begins to support, in a strategic sense, a kind of alliance in the region to contain Sudan. I think it's important to mention this. So Uganda, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. And so that, to the degree that counterterrorism matters in this period in the 1990s, it's part and parcel of the strategic containment of Sudan. But obviously after 9/11, I think it's fair to say that from the perspective of Western countries, counterterrorism becomes sort of the central strategic interest for the United States and European partners in the Horn of Africa. And I think we'll get into this more, but a number of countries in the region recognized that fact and sought to instrumentalize the war on terror for their own political gain, in particular for the consolidation of political power at home.
Thanks, Michael. And of course, that strategy you mentioned about containing Sudan from the U.S. also in practice bolstered the SPLA rebellion in the South with, of course, major consequences later. That segues me pretty well to taking us into a bit more of these specifics rather than the broad scope. Of course, I think when people think of the war on terror in this region, they often think of Somalia first. But I'm actually going to first go and ask about Sudan, which we've already started talking about, because I think in some ways, Sudan was the place where perhaps the earliest effects of this big overall change was perhaps most felt. Now, I'm going to punt this one over to you, Murithi. Obviously, Sudan was already on the state sponsor of terror when 9/11 happened. But then how did 9/11 and the events that follow really change the direction of that country, really significantly?
Yes, so of course we have to remember that the coup in 1989 that brought Omar al-Bashir in power was very much supported by an Islamist group that was further to the right of people like Bashir. And so he felt under pressure to prove his Islamist credentials. Of course, then there was a degree to which he became host to a number of groups that were just more than Islamist, were perhaps more Salafi jihadist. And then when 9/11 happened, I think Bashir saw a threat to his survival. I think the most important development was the ouster of Saddam Hussein just 2 years later. He saw this as an existential threat. So while we should not overstate this, it's important to note that Bashir was already under very significant cross-party pressure over in DC because of the abuses in Darfur. But to ensure the survival of his regime, he began to offer substantial counter-terrorism cooperation to the US. And in this period, when he was in a very weak position, then, of course, we know that the long struggle for South Sudanese independence had been bubbling for a long time. They were demanding a referendum on secession. And I think in that weak moment, it's very important to recognize what a massive concession it was, even for a weak Khartoum, to agree to the comprehensive peace agreement, but they did. And I think that's one of the significant developments that took place in the region. The fact that these autocrats saw that to survive, they had to enlist somehow in the so-called war against terror, but also very significant domestic developments happened in that period.
Mm. And Mary, of course, you've written about how 9/11 has not only changed the fate of Somalia, but even you wrote once as even rewrote Somalia's history in a way. I'm wondering, what did you mean by that? And maybe can you just remind our listeners and walk us through how the U.S. approach and even regional approach that took place after 9/11, how it's led us to the current situation in Somalia today?
I don't want to oversimplify, but what I argued in my book, which is called Getting Somalia Wrong, so that might give you a hint, is that after 9/11, Somalia was associated with this whole very extreme, violent branch of Islamism. And to put it sort of simply, during that time, there were a bunch of warlords who were causing havoc in Somalia and controlling different bits of the territory, even different bits of the capital, Mogadishu. And they were backed in part by the CIA, because they said that they were countering an Islamist threat. And then, much to everybody's surprise, this group of Sharia courts, which had been providing security in some parts of the country and really changing things, they actually overthrew these warlords and came to some kind of power, at least in the capital Mogadishu and other parts of South and Central Somalia. Then what happened was that they did, without trying to kind of paint too bright a picture on them, but they did dramatically improve security and made people's lives much more predictable. But after just 6 months of them being in power, the Americans and the Ethiopians and a few others, they basically labeled this Islamic Courts Union, as it was called, as a sort of Al-Qaeda affiliate, having sympathy with violent Islam, and they bombed them out of existence. And what happened was that the sort of armed youth wing that had been associated with the courts, they disappeared into the bush, but re-emerged as Al-Shabab. And to this day, it controls vast swathes of the country and attacks towns and cities that are officially controlled by the government and its allies. So, I mean, it is oversimplistic to say that American policy created Al-Shabaab, a little bit like some argue that American policy created the Taliban in Afghanistan. But there was definitely a link between American policy and the flourishing of Al-Shabaab.
Thanks, Mary. Michael, can you also expand a bit more on how regional countries were able, as you mentioned, to instrumentalize this war on terror and play their own role?
I mean, I think with the benefit of hindsight and sort of taking a broad view, and obviously there's country by country variation here, I think we can say that the war on terrorism has mostly had negative impacts on democracy and governance in the Horn of Africa. And I think there are a couple of mechanisms at work here. You know, the first is that the United States and other Western countries in this period were oftentimes very reluctant to push hard on sort of issues of democracy and governance with a number of countries in the region, so as not to jeopardize their counterterrorism partnerships. So, you know, I think the classic cases of this would be Uganda, Ethiopia under the EPRDF, Djibouti. I think it's also the case that authoritarians, autocrats in the region have instrumentalized the war on terror for the purposes of regime maintenance through access to external security assistance, by sort of very effectively blurring the line politically and legally between terrorism and what otherwise might be considered legitimate political activity. And then I think, I'll maybe leave it here. I think the war on terror frame offered sort of new moral and legal justifications for the use of specific coercive tools by governments in the region. I'm thinking about extrajudicial assassinations, rendition, torture, surveillance. I don't think these governments use these tools because of the war on terror. These tools were in existence before that, but it did provide sort of new moral and legal justifications for their deployment.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a bit more about Ethiopia, especially what's happening with Ethiopia at the moment, because for years and years, Ethiopia was considered by the US principally and other Western powers as being its kind of key ally in the war on terror in the Eastern Horn of Africa. It was the kind of bulwark against the threat. And what I'm really fascinated to see what happens now. You look at the way that the US is speaking to Ethiopia in terms of the war that's going on in the Tigray region and beyond. It's like, does it still, how concerned is it that it's basically lost Ethiopia as that strong man in the region? Because at the moment, it's coming down pretty hard on the Abiy government in terms of human rights abuses and blockading of aid. And is it sitting there measuring, thinking, oh, we have to be careful, we can't be too hard on them because we need them as our kind of frontline state? It's difficult to work it out. And then obviously, with all the chaos that's going on in Ethiopia, I'm sure Al-Shabaab, in fact, I spoke to Al-Shabaab about this and I said, are you going to take advantage of that and strike your main enemy, as you've always described it? And the Al-Shabaab official who I was speaking to was kind of laughing. He said, we don't need to attack them now. We could attack them whenever we want, but they're destroying themselves. So we're just sitting on the sidelines and watching Ethiopia fall apart. He was kind of rubbing his hands in glee about this. But you do really wonder how this is going to change the whole complexion and nature of the sort of Islamist versus kind of non-Islamist states in the region. It's going to be really interesting and disturbing to see how that unfolds.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. These are all really fascinating reflections, and actually, these reflections on Ethiopia and and the role of the war on terror, in some ways, the through lines there to the current war in Tigray just speaks to kind of how it really has seeped into all corners in a way that you might not expect. I also always wonder about the sort of counterfactual when it comes to Eritrea, and the way that the Addis Ababa regime was able to help isolate its enemy in Asmara because of Eritrea's support to Al-Shabaab and the way that got caught up in this war on terror as well. Murithi, I wanted to go to you also to reflect on these, but also if you could speak a bit how other quote unquote allies or partners of the U.S. in the war in Somalia, how they were also able to instrumentalize, especially Nairobi and Kampala in terms of their own interests.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Just a very quick caveat that I think while Meles Zenawi, the former prime minister of Ethiopia, certainly saw an opportunity to ease the Western pressure that was piled on Addis Ababa following the very bloody aftermath of the 2005 election, I think just to be fair, it's also important to note that the Ethiopians partly acted out of their national interest. It's very important to say that, you can't overstate how scarred Ethiopia was by Somalia's irredentist wars back in the 70s and 80s. And so, they partly worried about an Islamist government that might again be redentist in Mogadishu. But of course, Meles did instrumentalize it. He called it Africa's Taliban and whatnot. And in fact, it worked. It eased the pressure on Ethiopia. On the wider East Africa, the reverberations continue for sure. Today, the Tanzanian opposition leader Freeman Mbowe is spending his second month in jail, charged with terrorism, all because he demanded constitutional change. The Ugandans were very shrewd. Of course, Yoweri Museveni is a past master at this sort of activity. He sent his troops into Somalia in the late 2000s, partly because, he was under very significant domestic pressure. Of course, we should not understate the fact that they made very huge sacrifices and actually succeeded in pushing Al-Shabaab from having effective control of Mogadishu. But this did, in fact, ease the pressure on Kampala. It very much restored Museveni's place as a very important partner to the West. And according to his domestic critics, it was a cynical deployment that worked in multiple strands. You have to remember these deployments are also quite lucrative, to be honest, very substantial stipends. You keep a very large army busy, and you take care of domestic opponents by claiming you're a Western ally. I think the Kenyan case is very interesting. The Kenyans decided that Al-Shabaab was becoming an intolerable threat in northern Kenya. This is still debatable, but they intervened in Somalia in 2011, but in a way that has ended up redounding on Kenya in very negative ways. You've had waves of attacks in a country that doesn't have the same security apparatus that Ethiopia had or that Uganda boasts today. You've had tensions between Muslims and Christians, partly because Al-Shabaab tried to attack churches to divide society. You had a very bad effect on tourism. And so I think Kenya has been one of the worst affected countries, partly because it was really a mistake for the Kenyans to intervene militarily while knowing that they don't have the domestic capability to take care of security.
And quickly, Murithi, before I move on, I'm just wondering, we've talked a lot about, what the U.S. got wrong. I'm wondering, do you think the U.S. got anything right in the way it went about after 9/11 in this region?
I would say that it's often sometimes simplistic to always criticize the military first method. I think to a certain degree, when Al-Shabaab began to ally openly with Al-Qaeda, it declared its allegiance. So the initial intervention was very wrong. To a certain degree, the later American support to help, as they call it, degrade Al-Shabaab's capacities was probably quite effective. Only that, like in many places, there was no strategy of what would replace Al-Shabaab when it was pushed out, for example, of urban areas. There was no plan to stand up domestic capacity to govern some of those areas. And so while some of the military interventions may have given some space to domestic government actors, I think the problem was there was an absence of a strategy of what would replace the militants when they were pushed out. And of course, in the event, they quickly came back, as Mary has recorded, and now are able to employ their taxation methods almost across the country.
Great, thanks everyone. I think that gave us a very broad tour of many complex situations. Michael, I'm going to give you the last word, and then I'll take us to discussing looking ahead a bit more rather than just looking backwards.
Mary makes a really interesting point. It's interesting to me. I wonder if I guess what you could describe as a very sort of tough U.S. line on Ethiopia would have been possible in 2005, 2006, 2007. And I think in an interesting way, the U.S.'s approach to the crisis in Ethiopia, particularly the conflict in Tigray, tells us something about the way in which the war on terror frame has declined in relevance from the perspective of the United States and its Western partners. It's clearly not at the center of the conversation for U.S. policymakers in a way that it was 10 years ago. And I think that's something that's interesting to acknowledge. You mentioned the case of Eritrea. I mean, that's kind of a unique, the impacts of the war on terrorism on Eritrea, were unique. Obviously, it fed into its international isolation. Ethiopia and Eritrea had a rivalry that really emerged in a significant way in 1998 over border and other issues. And effectively what happened as a byproduct of the war on terror is that the United States intentionally, unintentionally began to favor Ethiopia in the context of that rivalry, in large measure because Ethiopia was such a crucial counterterrorism partner in Somalia. And so that led to a kind of chain of developments in which relations between the United States and Eritrea got much worse, which then sort of paved the way for Eritrea's international isolation in fora like the United Nations Security Council. Just a final point that, an issue that Murithi talked on, sort of what, success is in terms of sort of the war on terror in this region and sort of Western policy, because we have talked a lot about the negative. I mean, I think if you look at it from a sort of narrow, sort of national interest perspective, there haven't been attacks on the U.S. homeland from groups emanating in this region in the last 20 years, at least, and attacks on sort of Western assets in the region.
All right, thanks everyone. So Mary, I'm going to come back to you and do a bit of a segue. As I mentioned at the start of our conversation, and has been evident throughout this mini series we're doing on jihadism, we couldn't have had more dramatic events, I think, to mark this 20 years as what we've seen out of Afghanistan. And so it's difficult to sort of look ahead without, reflecting on what's happened in Afghanistan. Mary, you've, written extensively about Al-Shabaab. As you've been watching the events in Afghanistan and how that played out, how do you think this will shift both the conversation, but also actually the events, future events in Somalia? And how has this all looked to Al-Shabaab?
Yeah, that's a great question. Al-Shabaab, from what I understand, is pretty thrilled that the Taliban have achieved what they have achieved. And in some sense, there are some signs that it's given Al-Shabaab a bit of a momentum in terms of its activities on the ground, even though it's a bit too early to say how successful Al-Shabaab is going to be with this kind of injection of energy and, I suppose, optimism on their part. I often sort of think to myself, what would happen if Al-Shabaab took over in Somalia? Because they do govern, this is probably quite a controversial thing to say, but they do govern better in many ways than the alternatives that are trying to exert any kind of authority in Somali's regions or federally. And the population of Somalia, even if they don't like a lot of what Al-Shabaab stands for, they say, well, at least in Al-Shabaab areas, there's a degree of predictability, there isn't corruption, legal cases get sorted out quite soon, taxation is efficient, and at least some of the taxation goes towards kind of community projects. I, in fact, know Somalis who've sent their families out of so-called government-controlled areas into Al-Shabaab areas because they say actually it's safer for them there as long as they abide by the rules. And obviously, the West and the Somali authorities in Mogadishu and in the regions, obviously they would fundamentally disagree and say it would be an idea of hell if Al-Shabaab took over. But maybe, we don't know how the Taliban is going to perform this time. We don't know exactly how severe they're going to be. But maybe if the Taliban establish a government that is obviously going to be repressive and sort of anathema to a lot of what the West stands for, maybe it isn't going to be as bad as it was and as bad as people imagine. And maybe that will give those that believe that the only way that Somalia is going to get sorted out to any extent at all is to have some kind of deal with Al-Shabaab. If Al-Shabaab is prepared to accept that there would have to be negotiations, and eventually Al-Shabaab would have to be part of the political structure. So I think it's going to be really interesting, number one, to see what happens in Afghanistan under the Taliban and whether that can teach any lessons about some sort of future involvement of Al-Shabaab in the governance of Somalia, the sort of formal recognized governance of Somalia, and also to see whether Al-Shabaab takes more inspiration, not only militarily, but also in terms of establishing some kind of government, which is what it sees it has already. It tells me it has a parallel shadow government in Somalia, and I think that's true. And what kind of inspiration it will take from the Taliban now being the government rather than a shadow government.
Yeah, it really does feel like a chapter in contemporary history just turned, and this is also very interesting and all in some ways very new. The conversations going along these lines. Murithi, I'm wondering if you can talk us through maybe how regional leaders you think have been viewing what's been going on in Afghanistan.
Yeah, so just to echo Mary's point, my colleagues and I have been following Al-Shabaab's websites, and you'll see that every single day since mid-July, the top story and the next three have been about Afghanistan. There's obviously a degree of exuberance. They're very happy. They haven't issued an official statement yet, but 2 days ago, Al-Qaeda issued a statement which said, liberate the Levant, Somalia, Yemen, Kashmir, and the rest of the Islamic lands from the enemies of Islam. So you can see, of course, this, they're taking note, and without question, they hope that they too one day might be able to outweight the international deployment and potentially capture power. I would say just very quickly on the point you raised about Afghanistan, Alan, I've been struck by the coverage, and maybe this is also a controversial point. A lot of the coverage has focused on what will life be like for Afghanistan and for Afghans in the days after the Taliban captures power. I think an important question not to lose sight of is what was life like for Afghans under the Western supported government, the internationally supported government, and during the war. And I think this comes to Mary's point about what kind of governance do these governments that receive massive amounts of foreign aid, what kind of governance is the Somali government giving its people today? And that gives you a clue as to how long it would survive if this external support, including military support, was pulled out. And I think that's the conversation people need to have. It's almost acting as if you have a government, but in reality, what you have is a small elite that's benefiting from these millions and millions of unconditional aid that's flowing in, and therefore have no incentive to offer services to the people, which is why, even though life can be quite harsh in the Al-Shabaab controlled areas, you have predictability, you have peace, and you have a degree of governance that may be very crude, but also that delivers. And I think that's the conversation people need to have. How are regional leaders looking at this? Again, I would twin this point with what happens next. I would say that if Al-Shabaab can demonstrate that it does not still, as its propaganda likes to pump out, aim to engage in irredentist wars. It does not seek, to try and take back Djibouti, Somaliland, the Ogaden region, northern Kenya, which is not really a very realistic goal. If that could be diffused, then regional leaders that remained the most hostile to the idea of talks with Al-Shabaab might soften. I remember in the late 2000s, it was the Americans that were adamantly opposed to any prospect of rapprochement, especially in the age when Sheikh Sharif Ahmed was president. He was the former head of the Islamic Courts Union. It might have been possible to do a deal then. Now Al-Shabaab is very strong. It might be harder to do a deal, but it's hard to see how you stabilize Somalia without looking for an off-ramp that must involve talks with a group that's as formidable as Al-Shabaab.
Yeah, I've also been struck by the coverage out of Afghanistan, and there hasn't been much coverage of how life might be changing for rural Afghans where the civil war actually took place, and the fact that that civil war in Afghanistan, that's waged for 20 years, might now be ending, and that hasn't received nearly as much focus. And you could easily see parallels with that, I think, with Somalia as well. Michael, I want to go over to you. You mentioned in your last comments that in some ways the frame of the war on terror, has already been shifting in the US, even before Afghanistan, and the sort of weight that takes. If we're entering sort of a new phase, of US engagement in this region, how would you characterize that phase? And in what ways do you think Afghanistan accelerates that?
Yeah, well, maybe I could just talk a little bit about sort of the shadow of Afghanistan in the Horn of Africa, and sort of how it may or may not sort of impact the international community's sort of calculations, particularly on the situation in Somalia. I mean, I think As you all well know, I mean, there's a lot of debate and back and forth right now about, it's called the Somalia transition plan, sort of what to do with AMISOM. And, I could really see sort of the situation or the recent developments in Afghanistan playing out in two ways. I mean, on the one hand, I think it's a note of caution to the international community, Somalia's sort of Western partners, about sort of the dangers of exiting too quickly, too precipitously, drawing down AMISOM in too rapid a fashion. On the other hand, if the Taliban is able to sort of normalize its relationship with the rest of the world and sort of be, quote unquote, sort of responsible player in the international system, it's not sort of a security problem for its neighbors and the rest of the world, then there may be more willingness, to draw down in Somalia more quickly, and frankly, sort of pave the way for Al-Shabaab to make gains and maybe even recapture or capture the state, possibly, right? So I could see. I'm not sure how it's going to shake out, what the impact of developments in Afghanistan will be, but I think it could move in very different ways depending on how things play out. Sort of where is sort of U.S. Western policy going now? It's hard to say. Obviously, counterterrorism still is a concern. So I don't want to suggest that it's not. But I mean, you obviously are all aware of discussions around again, quote unquote, great power competition and the challenges that China, Russia pose from the perspective of Western countries in the Horn. So I think that's one frame that will be relevant. And the risk there, of course, is that if that becomes the frame for Western engagement in the Horn, then you are kind of perpetuating or creating the same pathologies of engagement with countries in the region that existed in the War on Terror. That is, putting aside really essential questions of democracy and governance in pursuit of these broader security interests. But I would say that we are at a moment in which, and Ethiopia, I think, is an example of this, where it has become more possible for the United States and its partners to really engage robustly on humanitarian issues, human rights, governance, because we're sort of in a space where counterterrorism is not the priority, but we haven't fully transitioned to a sort of great power competition frame, and there's now space for getting at these, I guess, softer, less securitized issues and interests, and I think that's important. But we'll see how it shakes out.
Okay, everyone, this has been an incredibly rich discussion. I think I'm going to close things out by posing the same question to all three of you, and asking, what might a better approach, both from the U.S. and regional governments look like when it comes to, what is still a jihadism threat in this region. And we've talked about a bit some, but just final reflections on, what is there an end game here? Or, is this still essentially a forever war, and one that just takes a much different overall tone than before? So Michael, I'm actually going to go back to you first on this.
Yeah, well, I mean, sort of two issues I'd mentioned. I mean, I think from the perspective of countries in the region, but certainly its partners, international partners, I think prioritizing sort of essential questions of democracy and governance is important. I've always believed that's important, and that is, I think, in one way, albeit an indirect way, of addressing some of the underlying grievances that have fueled the terrorism problem in the Horn of Africa region, much of the rest of the world. And then, to sort of piggyback on a point that Murithi made earlier, I mean, I think the terrorism problem in this part of the world really calls for, at this point, some political solutions, particularly when you recognize that a group like Al-Shabaab itself is rooted in some local grievances, local rivalries and dynamics. And I think one unfortunate consequence of the war on terror was that these local rivalries and grievances were securitized so much that it became very difficult to approach them through a political lens, right? I mean, there was a moment in the war on terror where there was sort of no middle ground. You're either for the terrorists or you're not, right? And that made it very difficult to deal with local grievances and local groups that had aligned with these international jihadist networks, but were not really of the same stripe. And so I think political solutions are really what's needed, as difficult as it may be.
And Mary, if I may, if we've been getting things wrong, then what does it look like to get things right? And do you see, what do you see as the end game?
in some ways, I feel more pessimistic than I felt in the last couple of decades about not only the future of Somalia, but about now, because of what's happening in Ethiopia, the future of the whole region. Because at the moment, the Horn of Africa has lost its rock of stability, even if it was a very authoritarian rock in Ethiopia. So how that's going to play out, I find it frankly pretty terrifying. But in terms of the more positive possibilities, taking a cue from Michael, I do think when you look at Somalia, for example, there is much more of an appreciation internationally, regionally, and locally that you can't solve this problem militarily. And Al-Shabaab, I've spent the last couple of years talking a lot to people who've left Al-Shabaab. Fair enough, they're the kind of middle-ranking and low-ranking members, but most of them, especially the low-ranking members, they didn't join Al-Shabaab for anything to do with ideology. They joined it for economic reasons, principally, or fear because they were coerced or because they were bored. It was an activity. So actually, their motivation is not to do with a hardline Islamist ideology. It's something completely different. So if it was possible to address those issues, that's also very, very challenging. Then people would probably, if they had better alternatives, they'd follow those. I also always look at the example of Somaliland, which is a tiny, unrecognized territory in that very, very volatile region. And Somaliland has done everything from the bottom up without international assistance. And it has got a pretty well-functioning kind of semi-democratic political system. It has obviously elements of extremism in it increasingly, but it hasn't turned horribly violent. It is far more stable than most other places in the region, and it's managed that on its own without much international help. So maybe there are lessons to be learned there, that you take a much more localized, granular approach to trying to sort out the Al-Shabaab problems. There's already more now of an emphasis on elders and other members of the community getting involved in trying to bring people out of Al-Shabaab and negotiate locally. So maybe if people have more faith in that, rather than these big international powers coming in with their military might, that might be a very, very slow way forward, but it might actually achieve some results that make life better for the people of Somalia and the people of the whole region.
Yeah, I do think perhaps much belatedly the events in Afghanistan have zeroed everyone in on this question of whether or not externalized support in these sort of fragile states is actually something that can even work. Murithi, I want to give you the final word, unless anyone else wants to jump in later. And obviously we've been focusing a lot on the U.S. approach, which you can also do, but also I'm wondering if you can sketch out, how a regional approach might look like, regardless of whether or not it's a U.S.-led war on terror. The region does face a risk and threat from these ideologies, and what would be a better approach going forward, and where do you see this heading?
In terms of the region, two things. One is that, of course, there will have to be a security component to this that calls for very significant cooperation. On paper, there is cooperation. There's the IGAD Counter-Terrorism Center for Excellence. But in practice, these remain very siloed national approaches. And the truth is that the militants are incredibly adaptive. When they came under pressure, when a lot of Kenyan recruits, for example, returned to Kenya and then came under security pressure, a lot of them moved to Tanzania. In Tanzania, when the mix of East Africans came under pressure from the authorities, they moved over to Mozambique and found very accommodative nodes in which they could operate. I think the authorities have to be as adaptive as the militants have shown them to be. I think the final point I would make is that, as we've heard from Mary and Michael, some of the recruitment is based on grievances. Not all of it, some of it is ideological, but very substantial parts of it come from a sense of marginalization, a sense that elites in distant capitals don't really care. And so you find that Al-Shabaab is very adept at recruiting from minority clans that are not really involved in governance arrangements. In Kenya, we saw very substantial recruitment in northern Kenya and at the coast, where there were long-standing economic and political grievances. The same in southern Tanzania and partly in Zanzibar as well. I would say that what we've seen to a degree in Kenya and maybe in the Sahel in Niger is that decentralization might be a prescription that works in places that this is practicable. And so Al-Shabaab recruitment, for example, on the Kenyan coast was once sky high. Now it's very low, partly because Kenya adopted a constitution in 2010 that gradually dispersed power and resources in very substantial ways, in ways that then you could have local authorities that enjoy greater trust than those at the national level. I think in particular, Tanzania might benefit from this. Northern Mozambique could be addressed if you really give power and resources to the locals. And so I think you have, of course, to have a security component, but the lesson we've learned over the last 2 decades is that it alone does not work, and it has to be accompanied by a very substantial political strategy.
And Murithi, I'm actually going to take my prerogative as the host and ask you one quick follow-up, which is the other component, of course, that often gets talked about and that we've talked about a lot on this podcast is dialogue with Al-Shabaab. I'm wondering if you see any potential regional support for dialogue with Al-Shabaab after, this long deployment of AMISOM.
I would say that we need to watch the next election. If there's an election that brings a government that can cohere nationally, that might be able to work with the federal member states, there is appetite, for example, from Doha, given its relative success in Afghanistan, that it might want to facilitate those talks. And Doha wisely has been reaching out to the various regional capitals, particularly Nairobi. I would say that Kenya and Ethiopia will remain anxious. I would say that the securocrats sometimes overstate the threat of greater Somalia expansionism. I remember a Kenyan officer telling me that there's a reason that the Somali flag is 5-pointed. They will eventually try and cause trouble regionally. I would say this is an overstated anxiety. I think people have to be more pragmatic. You cannot have a perpetual AMISOM deployment. Michael was right to say that precipitous withdrawal would also potentially be problematic, but people have to look for a middle ground, and that middle ground inevitably will involve dialogue.
Thanks, everyone, for such a fascinating discussion.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Alan.
Thanks for listening. Once again, The Horn is a podcast from the International Crisis Group, and this special summer series is produced in partnership with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. As a final note, since this in some ways closes out the season 2 of the podcast, I need to acknowledge the colleagues in the Horn of Africa team and from our headquarters in Brussels who help us bring you this podcast every couple weeks. And a special thanks to Murithi Mutiga, one of our panelists today, who is very active behind the scenes in every episode. The quality of guests and discussion we aim to bring is very much a product of his dedication and support as well. And thanks also, of course, to you, our listeners. We always love to hear from you. Drop me a note at aboswell@crisisgroup.org or on Twitter @AlanBoswell. We'll be back soon with more. This episode was produced by Maeve Francis and Ida Holly Nambi. Hi, and welcome to a special series of The Horn.